6 minutes to 8. So Gary Glitter has gone back to prison this week after breaching his licence conditions after he was caught looking at a smartphone and trying to access the dark web.
So Glitter was freed last month after serving half of his 16-year term for abusing 3 schoolgirls. Some say it cast doubt over the rehabilitation of serial sex abusers.
So should convicted paedophiles remain behind bars for life? We're joined now by the CEO of the Safeguarding Alliance, Emily Constantus, who says that child sex offenders can't ever be rehabilitated. Emily, thank you for joining us. And we have defence barrister Chris Daw, who says that Gary Glitter's case shows that criminal justice does in fact work. I think people will be quite shocked, Chris, that you suggest that, because not a month after being released, he's already contravened the rules of his release and has had to go back inside.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think this is a really difficult subject, and I don't think there's any kind of binary answer to the issue of what you do with sex offenders. But the reason why I suggest that in this case the system's worked is because licence conditions imposed on released sex offenders are intended to pick up this sort of behaviour that looks like someone may be on a journey towards further offending and get them back into prison quickly without any legal process, and that's what's happened. So,
wasn't the expectation, though, that he was sentenced to a 16-year term? He served half of that 16-year term. Within that 16-year term, the rehabilitation should have happened during that period.
Exactly. And
so,
exactly.
But he's been out a month and he's already contravened the rule.
Exactly, and what does that tell you about how we are failing to do anything?
Well, it sounds like he's not been rehabilitated.
Well, exactly, and we're failing in our prison system to rehabilitate sex offenders in particular. The prison system's a completely ineffective way of rehabilitating most people, but it fails most seriously and most regularly in the case of sex offenders, particularly sex offenders like Glitter, who have been offending for 50, 60 years, very, very long periods, and who didn't get caught until many, many years after the offending that they committed. These are very difficult cases, and we absolutely need to look at the most important thing of all: how do you reduce the risk of further offences?
So it works, sort of, in this situation.
I completely disagree. Actually, how could he even be put in a position to be able to reoffend in the first place? If it was working and he'd been rehabilitated, he wouldn't have come straight out of prison and gone on to try and get to children. And actually, any risk is too much of a risk in relation to our children.
So there is a failure of rehabilitation, which you also agree is a process. But is there a failure of the system, the justice system, which allows people, after they serve their term, to come up for release? Because that is a tenet of our system, isn't it? We can look at cases like Gary Glitter's, and we can look at cases of repeat abusers, and we can form judgments about that. But, you know, a fundamental tenet of our system is people have a sentence, they serve their time, and they then have a chance to go back out into life.
I think Gary Glitter is a case, obviously, he got caught. My concern is the possible thousands of sex offenders that haven't been caught. Statistics that were identified by the Safeguarding Alliance identified that over 11,500 sex offenders failed to notify of a change to circumstance. And they, again, are the ones that have been caught. What about the sex offenders that haven't been caught? What about changing their name by deed polls? So actually, how do we manage sex offenders if we don't know where they are? And my issue is that actually, yes, it's going to cost money. Yes, we have a capacity issue, but there shouldn't be a price on a child's life.
Chris, if you say that it's not working and the system is broken, then why not just keep them inside full-time? Because if there's no chance that they can come out, they aren't going to reoffend.
Well, it depends who they are. Because sex offenders, including child sex offenders, there are hundreds of thousands of them in Britain. There are around 100,000 sex offenders on the sex offences register. Our prison population is bursting at the seams, and it's 80 or 85,000. So in order to imprison every single child sex offender, you would need to double, triple or quadruple the capacity of our prisons. The cost of that will be absolutely astronomical, and ultimately it doesn't work, because what does work is early intervention as soon as there's any sign of criminal behaviour by these people, and diverting them from further offences.
Which is what you say.
Putting them in prison is just teaching them. They hang out with other sex offenders and they actually learn from each other in prison.
Emily,
that's the catastrophe we have in our system.
I'm really sorry, Chris, but I disagree, because even outside of prison, they're still hanging out with other sex offenders, and they've got open access because they're doing it online.
Yeah, absolutely, but that's a monitoring issue. You're absolutely, I think we can agree on this. Monitoring arrangements for sex sex offenders in the community are appalling. People slip through the net, thousands and thousands of them. But that's not a reason to imprison every single one. Only a small minority reoffend, as you know, over the course of a lifetime. And we'd be imprisoning people for, what, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years? For an offence that ordinarily would receive no prison sentence at all.
I think even that small minority, though, is going to impact such a large majority of children. And you mentioned, obviously, the capacity. Yes, we know over 80,000 prisoners, only 12,000 of those are actual sex offenders. There are over 60,000 sex offenders living in the community. How many of them are child sex offenders? And the risk is too great.
The vast majority, in fact, all of them, of our viewers' comments have come in on your side, Emily, with regards to this. Everybody is pretty convinced that actually keeping them inside is the only answer. But when you realise the scale of what that would involve, Chris...
I think the reason people have that reaction, and it's an understandable one, is that it's an emotive reaction to a very, very difficult and emotive subject. Policymakers and the law has to step back from that and ask one simple question. How do we reduce the number of offences and the number of victims? And longer prison sentence has been proven every time to fail on that critical measure.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, but thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Emily, for joining us this morning.
Now, if you've been affected by any of the issues we've been discussing, you can find advice and support at itv.com/helplines.